right, hi, this is Mrs. Vance, where we are going to be doing Algebra 1, Chapter 8.4. We're going to solve polynomial equations in factored form. Before we begin getting into the key concepts, let's go ahead and do the warm-up exercises. Go ahead and take a minute and do that on your own. Pause the video here if you'd like to. Okay. And you should have come up with an answer of 9x squared minus 49. Should be able to maybe look at that and do it. It's the same idea, same concepts inside there. Okay? All right, moving on down the note page. Our key concept today that we're going to work on, the first one, is the zero product property. Okay? So let's let A and B be real numbers. And if A times B equals 0, then obviously A has to equal 0 or B has to equal 0. We are going to obviously be using this property in our solution today as our solving equations. So the zero product property is used to solve an equation, not an expression, when one side is 0 and the other side is a product of polynomial factors. For example, when we have x plus 7 times the quantity 2x minus 3 equals 0, since we're multiplying those two quantities together, either the quantity x plus 7 must be 0, or the quantity 2x minus 3 must be 0 because of the multiplication, the zero product property. The solutions of such an equation are also called roots. So for using the zero product property, for example 1, it says solve the following equation. X minus 4 times x plus 2 equals 0. So using the zero product property, we're going to set x minus 4 equal to 0, or x plus 2 has to equal 0. So we're going to solve each equation separately. So when we solve the x minus 4 equals 0, adding 4 to both sides, we get x equals 4. Solving the other equation, subtracting 2 from both sides, we get x equals negative 2. So our two solutions are 4 or negative 2. Either one of those would make that equation true. So let's check. If we put in 4 for x, this parentheses becomes 4 minus 4, and this parentheses becomes 4 plus 2 equal to 0. 4 minus 4 is 0, and 4 plus 2 is 6, and obviously 0 times 6 is 0, and 0 equals 0. So that checks. Let's check our next solution. Put in negative 2 for both of our x's. So we get negative 2 minus 4 and negative 2 plus 2, and that equals 0. In this first parentheses, we end up with a negative 6, and in our second parentheses, we end up with 0, and 0 equals 0. So these two solutions do check out. Now you should pause your video and go ahead and do the guided practice that's provided on your page, number 1 and number 2. Okay, now that you've paused and done your guided practice, we will check those answers tomorrow when you come to class. Our next example is just finding a greatest common monomial factor. To remind you of a monomial, that is a it's a constant or a product of a constant and one or more variable. So we have two monomials here for a binomial. We have 12x plus 42. So we want to look at this expression and see what do those two monomials have in common. And what they share is let's see, well, 2 goes into 12 and 2 goes into 42, but 3 also goes into 12 and 3 also goes into 42. Does 4 go into 12? Yes, but does 4 go into 42? No. What about 6? Does 6 go into 12? And 6 into 42? Yes, and then 12. So 6 would be our greatest common factor between those two monomials. So we're going to factor out a 6. So in other words, we're going to pull that 6 outside of that binomial, out of that binomial, which would leave us, when we divide 12x by 6, we are left with 2x. When we divide 42 by 6, we are left with 7. So kind of like we're working backwards from where we started in this chapter. We started with seeing something like this right here, and we factored that in by distribution. Now multiply that in by distribution. Now we're going to be factoring it out. So instead of multiplication, we are going to be doing division and pulling a factor out of the two monomials. We can check it by distributing it back through and making sure we come back to our original expression. So 6 times 2x is 12x, and 6 times 7 is 42. So we do come back to our original expression. And there's no other common factors inside there that we missed. Okay, so let's try letter B. Let's look at 4x to the fourth plus 24x cubed. Let's look at our coefficients first. Do they have anything in common? And yes, we see that 4 and 24 both share a factor of 4, a common factor of 4. So we know we can pull a 4 out, or we can divide by 4, and this is the correct way to say it. And then now let's look at our variables. We have x to the fourth, and we have x cubed. So in our first monomial, we have 4 x's being multiplied together. And in our second monomial, we have 3 x's being multiplied together. So they both share at least 3 x's. So we can pull 3 x's or divide by x cubed. Pull 3 x's out or divide by x cubed. So let's take the 4 that we have that they have in common, and let's take the x cubed that they have in common, and let's divide each of those by that. So 4 divided by 4, well, that basically leaves us an understood 1. And x to the fourth divided by x cubed just leaves us with 1x. Okay? Our plus sign will stay the same. 24 divided by 4 is 6. And x cubed divided by x cubed, well, they kind of cancel out or become an understood 1. So that means we're finished with that term. And again, to check, we can just distribute through. We can do the reverse. Just check to make sure you go back to your original expression. So 4x cubed times x gives us 4x to the fourth. And then 4x cubed times 6 gives us 24x cubed. And that is our original expression that we had at the top. Okay? Take a moment to pause the video and do your guided practice 3 and 4, please. And we will move on to page 2. Now that you've paused the video, you've done your guided practice. Let's go ahead and do our example 3. Solve an equation by factoring. We cannot use the zero product property on that equation because we do not have a product. We have a sum. We have a binomial. We have a sum. But if we look at our coefficients and we find they have a common factor of 2, and we look at our variables and they have a common factor of x. There's x squared and then there's just x. So we can pull that 2x out or divide by 2x, leaving us with just 1x inside the parentheses and then a plus 4 for our other monomial. So we factor that out, and just in your head do a mental check. 2x times x is 2x squared. 2x times positive 4 is positive 8x. So we have factored correctly, and there's no more factoring to do inside the parentheses. Now we have a product. So now we can do a zero product property, or use the zero product property. So obviously our first product is this outside the parentheses right there. Our 2x has to be 0, or or our x plus 4 must equal 0. One of those two items multiplies together. If they both multiply together to get 0, one of these two items has to equal 0. So now we solve for x. We divide both sides by 2, and obviously the only answer we can get here is x equals 0. And then over here we subtract 4 from both sides and we get x equals negative 4. Okay? So our options here are 0 and negative 4. Those are our answers, our solutions. You can plug those in and check them. We know that 2 times 0 is going to be 0, and 0 plus 4 is 4, but 0 times 4 is 0. So that checks out. And then if we put negative 4 in for x, we obviously see negative 4 plus 4 will make this term 0, making the entire thing 0. Okay? Okay, let's move on to our example 4. Solve an equation by factoring. Again, this is the same idea. The difference here is we have a variable on our left side of the equation and we have a variable on the right side of the equation, and we don't have a 0 in the equation anywhere at all. So the first thing to do is we want to subtract 15n from each side so that we get one side equal to 0. Okay, that's our objective here, is we need this side to be equal to 0 so that we can even use the zero product property. So by subtracting 15n from both sides, we now have a binomial on the left. Now we can take that binomial and we can factor the left side of the equation. We look at our coefficients 6 and 15, and they have a common factor, greatest common factor of 3. Look at your variables. We have n squared and n, so they have a common factor of just 1n. So we're going to divide our binomial by 3n. And when we divide or pull out that 3n, what's left on the inside is 2n plus 5. Again, do a quick mental check and multiply. 3n times 2n is 6n squared, and 3n times negative 5 is negative 15n. Just to check to make sure you factored correctly. It's always good to check that. Now that we have a product on the left side of the equation, we can use the zero product property. We know that 3n must be 0 or 2n minus 5 must be 0. One of those two has to be true if this product equals 0. So that being said, we will divide both sides of this first equation by 3, and our first option is n is going to be equal to 0. Our second option, we're going to add 5 to both sides, and we end up with 2n equal to 5. Divide both sides by 2, and we get n equals 5 halves, or 2.5, however you want to look at it. Our solutions are going to be 0. Let me go ahead and change that to or. I'm going to make that 0 or 5 halves. That's probably how we should be writing that, 0 or 5 halves. Those are our two options. Do a quick mental check. Put in 0 for 3n. 3 times 0 times 2n, 2 times 0. That looks like 20. That's what I get for being new at this. 2 times 0 minus 5 equals 0. So we have 0 times, and then 0 minus 5 is negative 5 equals 0, and 0 does equal 0. That checks. Okay. And then if we put in our 5 halves, we get 3 times 5 halves times the quantity, 2 times 5 halves minus 5. Let's make sure that equals 0. And then my brackets. And there's an equal 0 over there. 3 times 5 halves is 15 halves. Don't worry about that big fraction, because over here we're going to end up with 2 times 5 halves. Well, the 2's cancel out, leaving us with just 5 minus 5. And 15 halves times 0 equals 0, which again checks out. Now that's a lot of work for checking. If you can do that mental check in your head, but be very careful because when we do mental checks, sometimes we forget signs, we forget when we have fractions, we forget to do the reducing or multiplication correctly. So be very careful if you're going to do a mental check. All right, you can stop the video now, but please do guided practice 5, 6, and 7, and be ready to go over those answers when we come to class. Thank you for listening to my very first video. I'm a little nervous, so I appreciate you guys not snickering, which I'm hoping that you didn't, but you probably did. All right, thank you.